So today, we're going to be concentrating on the fourth and final section of Unetaneh Tokef. Since it's the capstone of the piyut, we should expect that it's meant to leave us with an intended message. I didn't mention on Tuesday, but I'm going to mention now that it was written as what's called a siluk, that is the final closing piyut before the kedusha. That's a genre in liturgy. It brings us into the kedusha, and the kedusha is always a moment of uplift in every setting in Judaism. So keep that in mind, that this is a siluk that's supposed to usher us into kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. But we're not going to be approaching this today in detachment from what we explored on Tuesday. This is not just self-contained, it's part of a larger piyut, which is why we spent some time on those other parts on Tuesday. My intention is not only to draw out an intended message from the poem, but also to show how it relates to, in some ways it echoes, in other ways it completes the other three sections. And perhaps most important, I aim to indicate that it can address the protests of the Marthas of the world. You remember Martha, who wrote to Rabbi Schulweis, that it can address the protests of those Marthas, because there are many, and that it can even add an additional dimension to the impact that it made on an insistently secular kibbutz like Beit HaShita, and on so many other communities who in the ensuing years in both Israel and in the diaspora have embraced their own version of the prayer in that musical setting. There was a question in the chat yesterday as I was reviewing it afterwards as to whether Beit HaShita still responded to this in the same way, say 3 years later. I think the answer is an emphatic yes. I visited there at the kibbutz after 7 years, and it was still among the things that people talked about when they talk to you about important parts of moments in the kibbutz. And remember, the Times of Israel article that we read about, it was written in 2012. That was a full 22 years later. So it did certainly have staying power. Now, I want to just give you the quickest recap. This is really at lightning speed of sections 1 to 3. So first section was about the annual day of judgment and its foreboding quality. The second was that the judgment comes to every creature with the fate of each decreed, written, and sealed. And third, that God wishes and waits for our turning back to Teshuvah, which began with that triad Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, and then goes on that God waiting for Im Yashuv Miyad Tekablo, when people turn back, you will happily and joyously receive them again. So with that recap, let's get to today's agenda. So in looking at the first section, I had noted on Tuesday, and I put some of the evidence of it up on the screen, and it was uploaded afterwards, noted the awesome and virtuoso fluency with scripture that the author had. And that fluency in scripture extended to rabbinic literature as well. Let me give you two cases in point. We already noted on Tuesday the obvious example of the line in the poem, the well-known line, Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, that echoes, with only a variation in the sequencing of the three words, echoes the Talmud Yerushalmi in Tractate Ta'anit. That we already looked at on Tuesday. But also, there's this. You may just think of this from memory, or if you wish, you can go back to page 1 in the source packet, which is where the full text of the prayer is. And if you look at the end, towards the end of the 5th line in the Hebrew, you have the phrase "V'chol ba'ei olam ya'avrun lefanecha kivnei maron." Now this kol ba'ei olam, all who have come into the world, pass before you, this is almost a verbatim quotation from the Mishnah in the first chapter of Rosh Hashanah, the second Mishnah in Tractate Rosh Hashanah. But what exactly that phrase meant, kivnei maron, was already puzzling to the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. One of its suggestions was that it referred to sheep, understanding maron as being coming from the same root as the word imrana, that refers to sheep, meaning one by one, as one would count sheep. I got a very clear sense of this in the oddest of places when 7 years ago I had attended, at the importuning of a brother-in-law of mine, I attended a rodeo in Houston. And one of the things that I saw was a kind of competition of how one can get cattle from one corral to another in numerical sequence. They all have blankets on them with numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you've got to. The competition is to make sure that they go through that opening from one corral to the other one by one. This is standard in shepherding and in cattle ranching. So one understanding of it is that it's about people coming like sheep one by one. Another understanding of it was that it was like the narrow ascent to Beit Choron, also one by one, as one would go on a very narrow ascent. You can't have two going at the same time, two abreast. And the third understanding was that it was like the soldiers of David's army. And this too was a suggestion in the chat yesterday, so another reason why I'm mentioning it now. Referring to what is an impressive coalescence of scholarly opinion that kivnei maron was actually and originally the Greek and Latin word kivenumeron, referring again to the one by one array of soldiers when they're being reviewed by the commander. And it seems so all of them are about being counted one by one. It seems from some manuscripts of the prayer that the poem's author did indeed take it to be kivenumeron. But at the same time, of course, the author of the poem was doing homage to the first of the suggestions in the Babylonian Talmud, that it was about sheepfolds. Because the very next words in the poem are, after all, not about soldiers, but kevakarat roe edro, as a shepherd looks for and looks after his flock. So that's another example of a person, an author here who not only has this kind of bikiyut, this broad familiarity with biblical literature, but has that deep familiarity with rabbinic literature as well, so that he's able to pull out one understanding of something and at the same time do homage to an alternative understanding. So this deep familiarity with both biblical and rabbinic texts, I'm putting it before you for a real reason, because as we saw, just as we saw at the beginning of the Piyut, this is going to be really important for us now. And we're going to encounter in this fourth and final part of the poem that kind of virtuosity yet again. So let's begin to look at that fourth section. We're going to do it, we're going to stay on page 1 for the moment, because I want you to see the beginning of it, which is the last 4 lines, which begin with the word emet, emet ki atahu yotzram. The translation of which is, truly you are their creator, yotzram, and you know their nature, yitzram. You are their creator, you know their nature, that is their constitution. And it seems clear that the poet here had in mind a passage in Talmud Brachot. It's on 61a, and I'm going to put it up on the screen with the citation, just so that you can see it. So look at what we have in Brachot 61a. What is the meaning of that which is written in Genesis 2? Then the Lord God formed Vayitzer, man. Why is it written with a double yud? You see, Vayitzer has 2 yuds in it. So Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi says, this is an allusion to what seems to have been some kind of folk saying, Oy li mi yotzri, ve'oy li mi yitzri. Woe comes unto me from my creator, yotzri, and woe comes unto me from my nature, my own constitution, yitzri. That is, when the Torah tells of the creation of the human being, it uses the word for create or fashion in the verbal form vayitzer, in which there seems to be a superfluous vav, and Shimon ben Pazi's interpretation of it is that, yes, we have a creator, but we also have a constitution of our own that goes its own way, and those two yuds create an existential conflict. Following one of them may mean disobeying and thwarting the other. I follow my constitution and my desires, I'm thwarting God. I follow God, I'm thwarting my own constitution, which, of course, is exactly what we're meant to be confronting on Yom Hadin, on the Day of Judgment. We're meant to be trying to resolve the tensions between our Yotzer and our Yetzer, which I think is not only shows another instance of familiarity with rabbinic literature, but kind of a brilliant move. And then, of course, it goes on to say, Kihem basar v'adam, we're back in the piyut on page 1. Adam yisodo me'afar v'sofo le'afar. Human beings come from dust and return to dust. B'nafsho yavi lachmo, expending their lives in their labor for their food. Well, there is this reference of coming from dust and returning to dust is an obvious point to Genesis chapter 3, where after the eating from the tree, God now emphasizes the inescapable mortality of human beings. Coming from dust were you made, and dust you shall be. And it's then augmented by the line that we just saw here, B'nafsho yavi lachmo, which also points to what follows in, what precedes it in Genesis chapter 3, B'zeat apecha tochal lechem. You will eat food only by the sweat of your brow. Ad shuvcha el ha'adama, until you return to that earth from which you were made. And that can be taken to mean ad shuvcha el ha'adama, which can be taken to mean you're going to sweat your way to your food all of your life, or perhaps more pointed than that, until that back-breaking work hastens your return to dust. B'nafsho yavi lachmo. So another beautiful example of both biblical and rabbinic imagery going through this. But now comes the heart of it, because what follows are 8 similes. Adam yisodo me'afar, etc., etc. Now mashul, here come the similes. Kacheres hanishbar, like broken earthenware, like withered grass, like a faded blossom, like a passing shadow, like a vanishing cloud, like blowing wind, like sprouting dust, and like a dream that will fly away. In other words, this part of the prayer, which is the finale of the siluk leading into the kedusha, let me just take this down, don't need to see this anymore. This finale reads as a kind of relentlessly dark sequence of thoughts on our impermanence, and thus perhaps one might be forgiven for sensing in this something about our ultimate unimportance, which you would have to admit is a kind of an unusual lead-in to the Kedusha, to Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Permit me an aside here. After 9/11, which you will recall was exactly a week before Rosh Hashanah, this list had a special force, I'm sure not just for me, because sprouting dust was exactly what the landscape around Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan looked like. And with the fall of the towers, the long shadows that they had always cast on Lower Manhattan had forever passed away. They were like a passing shadow. And with its fall, countless human dreams had vanished. And as long as I'm on this aside that I've allowed myself, I can't help recalling one more thing that haunts me every year to this day. On the afternoon of Shabbat Shuvah that year, we opened the Torah, as we always do, a mincha on Shabbat, and we read from Ha'azinu. And you know how that poem is written in the Torah? It's in a style that's called Ariach al Gabe Ariach, half bricks on top of half bricks. You look at Ha'azinu in the Torah, and you are seeing the Twin Towers. And it was, and for me, it is every year a kind of an after image of that which we thought as human builders was as permanent as anything could be. Now it was gone. So there are many things that we experience in life that drive home the brutal truth of this paragraph. Okay, enough asides. I want us to look at the sources here. And now we're going to move forward in our packet to page 6, where we have the fourth text, which is in 5 parts, 4a through 4e. And let's look at them. The first is from Isaiah chapter 40, verses 6 and 7. It happens to be the Haftarah for Shabbat Nachamu, so we will read it pretty soon. Kol omer kra v'amar ma ekra, kol habasar chatzir v'chol chasto ketzitz hasadeh, and then come in rapid succession, Yavesh chatzir, navel tzitz, ki ruach Adonai nashva bo, achen chatzir ha'am. Grass withers, blossoms fade, when a wind of the Lord blows over them. Indeed, humans are but grass. So as God is announcing the divine intention to return to the land of Israel, that's the context here. The presence of God had departed, as the prophet Ezekiel had told us. God is now announcing an intention to come back. Panu derech Adonai, prepare a road for God to come back. A command is now given to the prophet to announce that, but the prophet can only think of the futility of the message, given how transitory and how fragile human life is. So we have in these verses 3 of the 8 similes that are in this poem. Chatzir Yavesh, the withered grass, Tzitz Novel, the faded blossom, and Ruach Noshavet, the blowing wind. So that's 4a. 4b, Psalm 144, this is part of a puzzle in the psalm as to why the divine would even be concerned with us humans who are here today and gone tomorrow. And here, line that you know from Yizkor, Adam lahevel dama yamav kitzel over, his days are like a passing shadow. There comes the source for kitzel over in the poem. 4c, from Job now, chapter 7. This is from Job's second speech, and it's a speech in which he's reviewing his miserable life in terms that kind of anticipate Thomas Hobbes some 1,500 years later. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's almost exactly what Job says. He's going to die broken, and he's going to be gone just as a cloud vanishes or evanesces. Ke'anan kala. There's the source for that 5th simile. 4d from Isaiah chapter 5 is part of an indictment by the prophet of the corruptions in Judean society in his day in the 8th century. And the people who are perishable are indeed going to perish because of that. And they're going to blow away like dust. And there we have the source for avak poreach, ufircham. There's the poreach part of it, ka'avak ya'aleh, their buds shall sprout like dust, or fly away like dust. And finally, back in the book of Job, chapter 20, this is not Job speaking, but Job's third friend, whose name was Tzophar, who describes what he is sure is going to be the fate awaiting the wicked on earth. They are going to be as short-lived as a dream that suddenly disappears. He, the evil person, the wicked person, flies away like a dream, kachalom yauf, and cannot be found. 7 of these similes have their obvious sources in what we call Nach, the prophets and the writings. And notice again what we saw at the beginning on Tuesday, this bikiyut, this deep familiarity, even for texts that are never read in the synagogue. Right? You should note that. Isaiah 5 is not part of any synagogue liturgy, nor is the book of Job. And also note that 4 of these 7 come from the book of Isaiah. And once again, the poet seems to have, as we saw on Tuesday, a special affinity for that book. We'll get back to that at the very end. But here is the most important and most salient point. The poet has been true to the original context in all 7 of these cases. Because in their original context, whether it's in Isaiah or Psalms or Job, these phrases are metaphorical. They're not only metaphorical in our prayer, they're metaphorical in their original place and in these essentially the same way, that is, as a description of human life, whether it's Job's life or the life of the wicked or the life of the people or the life of humanity in general. So they're metaphors that have simply been moved by the poet from their scriptural context and moved into the liturgical composition with no change of meaning or no change of context. And there's nothing particularly eyebrow-raising about that except for one thing. Because you will probably, and may already have on the tip of your tongue, wondering why when we got to 4e, I said, finally, Job chapter 20. But of course, finally was not correct. Because there aren't 7 similes here, there are 8. And the one missing so far, the one we haven't looked at, is in fact the very first item on our list, Kicheres Hanishbar, broken earthenware. Now, given everything that we know about this poet, it must have a classical source. And the question is, what is that source? Well, something of this nature does have a mention in Breshit Rabbah, in that midrashic compilation on the book of Genesis. It's part of a narrative. It's part of an Agadah. And it's text number 5, which you will find on page 7 of the source packet. And let's take a look at it here. We're not going to break our teeth on the Aramaic here, but it starts with Ma'aseh bi'achad b'tzipori shemet beno, a story about a man in Tzipori, in Sepphoris, whose son died. It's a tragic story. It is said that a heretic was standing near him, an unbeliever, a non-believer, maybe even a scoffer. When Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta came to be present for him and to give him comfort. He came to be a comforting presence for him. He's making a Shiva visit, as we would put it. The heretic noticed that Rabbi Yossi, who was sitting across from the mourner, mourning for his son, he was sitting and smiling. And he asked him, "Why are you smiling?" And Rabbi Yossi responded, "We have faith in the Master of Heaven that he will again see his son in the next world." The heretic said, "Is it not enough that this man is suffering, that you come to add to his suffering with vacuous words? You're not helping him, you're hurting him. You're giving us some kind of a vain hope. And here he goes on and say, can a piece of earthenware, of earthen pottery, ever be put back together again? It chaspin mit dabkin, can they be fused together again? Is it not written," and here he quotes the second Psalm, "Kichli yotzer tenaptzem, you shatter them like potter's ware." Your words are unbelievable. That's what the heretic says. And it goes on from there. But here is here's the idea in the midrash that there is some analogy to be drawn between the human being who has died and earthenware that has been shattered. So there seems to be some kind of source in this, but although the text does speak of cheres, of earthenware, as fragile and susceptible to being irreparably shattered, two problems present themselves. First is that the word shavar, or it would mean in Aramaic, it would be tavar, does not appear here. And we're looking for the source that the poet would have had for kecheres hanishbar. The second problem is, given what we've seen about the other 7 similes, it seems much more likely that the author would have mined the Tanakh for a brief, crisp usage of cheres juxtaposed with shin bet resh, shavar, broken, just as he did for the other 7. He found those brief, crisp phrases that he lifted. That seems much more likely than him thinking of some rabbinic agadah that would somehow make its way in here. But if that is so, then there actually is only one place where he could have found this in Tanakh, because there is only one place in the whole Tanakh where the word for earthenware, cheres, is coupled with the Hebrew root for shattering or breaking, shavar, shin bet resh. And you have it here as text number 6 on page 7. And it comes from the most unlikely of places, Leviticus chapter 6. Happens to be my bar mitzvah parsha, but that's neither here nor there. Uchli cheres asher tevushal bo yishaver. An earthenware vessel in which it was boiled shall be broken. What is the it? It's talking about the flesh of the chatat, the purification offering, which according to priestly law, as given in the Torah, the chatat is kodesh kodashim, is holy of holies. So we have an earthenware vessel in which the flesh of that animal was boiled for consumption by the priests. And now what do you do with this earthenware vessel? Well, it shall be broken, it says, presumably broken to make it useless, because having been used for something that was Kodesh Kodashim, that was the Holy of Holies, no risk could be taken that it would subsequently be used for any mundane purpose, because that would be an impossible sacrilege. So the remedy was break it. But I want you to note this now. Unlike the other 7, which talked about wind and talked about shadows and talked about dust and talked about clouds, which were all metaphors, this is no metaphor. In this verse in Leviticus, we're talking about an actual, real earthenware vessel, not a symbolic one. This is a very concrete and priestly prescription for how a vessel made from earth is to be treated should it become unfit for normal human use. In the case of Leviticus, it becomes unfit for normal human use by having been used for the most sacred things. Well, okay, if that's the source, what could this priestly and ritualistic context possibly have to do with what the poet is trying to express at the end of Unetaneh Tokef? If, as seems clear, he found this phrase, cheres hanishbar, in Leviticus chapter 6, what is it doing here? What is its role and its function? So in order to unravel this, it's important to look more closely at what makes a vessel unfit for use. In both biblical and rabbinic law, vessels of any kind can become unfit for normal use, not only, as in the case of Leviticus 6, because of contact with the Most Holy, having been used for the boiling of the cooking of the flesh of the chatat sacrifice, It can also become unfit for normal use because of contact with impurity, tumah. And thus arises the question of whether it is in any way possible, how can impure, contaminated vessels be made pure and usable again, if at all? What would be the method for removing that impurity? So now many of these laws are said to have been derived from Parashat Matot, which we happen to have just read last Shabbat. That parashat talks about how after the Midianite war, there was the issue of purifying the vessels that were taken as spoils from the pagans. And it talks about Kol davar sheyavo va'esh ta'aviru ba'esh, or ta'aviru b'mayim if impossible, either by fire or by water, depending on the materials out of which the vessels were made. They could have been made of wood, they could have been made of leather, of fabric, or of various metals. And either they were going to be purified by fire, or they were going to be, as we would put it, immersed in a mikveh by water. But what about earthenware? Well, in that case, and drawing on our text in Leviticus, rabbinic literature ruled that earthen vessels could be purified by being broken. And to see that, we go to the next text, which is from Mishnah Kelim, not a very commonly studied tractate of the Mishnah. It's an extremely long tractate of the Mishnah, 30 chapters long. But right near the beginning, at the very beginning of chapter 2, we have what you have as text number 7 on page number 7. Please make sure everyone is muted. Thank you. Clay eitz, clay or, clay etzem, clay zchuchit, vessels of wood, leather, bone, or glassware. They are susceptible to impurity if and only if they have a concave receptacle. They have to actually be vessels, not just a sheet made out of a wooden plank, right? It has to be an actual vessel. And then the next words are at the very end of the first line in the Hebrew, nishberu taharu. If they are broken, they lose their impurity, which means, and the pieces cannot become impure. They are no longer even susceptible to impurity. So what does it mean, nishberu taharu, which is said of vessels of many kinds? What does the phrase mean? So one possibility is that it's meant almost as a facetious way of saying that breakage removes impurity because there's nothing left to be impure. The vessel is broken. It's irreparably gone. There is actually elsewhere in the Mishnah in a different context something just like that. If you want to look this up, it's in Bava Kama chapter 4, it's the 9th Mishnah, where they're considering the best way to keep under guard and out of the way of harming others, a shor muad. I would call that an ox who has a rap sheet of previous gorings. Rabbi Yehuda says there, ein lo shmira ela sakin. The only true method of guarding such an ox is the slaughtering knife. Exactly that kind of facetious comment. Don't think you can ever guard it. It can only be guarded when it no longer is. So in other words, we might be tempted to read these words, nishberu taharu, here in Mishnah Kelim, to mean, just as the verse in Leviticus 6, by the way, means, that the broken vessel is out of danger of impurity or sanctity because it's no longer a vessel. But we can't actually read it that way because of the very next somewhat surprising words in the Mishnah. So go back to text number 7. We're at near the beginning of this second line in the Hebrew. Chazar v'asa mehem kelim. If new vessels, literally, if one goes back, returns, chazar, and new vessels are made from the pieces, those vessels can again become impure or be made impure. Being able to become impure means that you are pure. That's what it means to become impure. If new vessels are made from the pieces, those vessels can again be made impure. That is, the Mishnah explicitly envisions, if not advocates, reassembling and refusing the broken pieces, the broken shards of the once impure or contaminated utensil as a means of rendering it from that point on a pure and usable vessel once again. So having said all this, the Mishnah now comes to the case of the Kli Cheres, the earthenware vessel. And the first thing we notice, we're near the end of the second line in the Hebrew and near the beginning of the fourth line in the English. Vessels of earthenware or saltpeter have identical rules. They contract and convey impurity through their airspace, and they can transmit impurity from their cavity to their outer walls, but they don't contract impurity through their outer walls. So what's that all about? Some special rules about the earthenware vessels. And we suddenly have a role being played by the airspace. Remember, we're talking about things that have a concavity, that have a place of receptacle, and you could hang something into it without having it actually touch the actual substantive sides of the vessel. So among the things that make the earthenware vessel unique is that impurity doesn't get contracted and transmitted in the same way that it would for, say, a metal or wooden vessel. In the case of metal or wooden vessels, a metal bowl, for example, would contract impurity if a source of tumah, like a dead insect, were to touch the vessel, even on the outside. Suspending that dead insect, which is a source of tumah, suspending it into the concavity of the metal bowl without touching it would do nothing. But not so for the earthenware vessel. Touching it on the outside with a dead insect, say, does nothing. Only the inside matters. And that extends even to the airspace in the concavity. So the Mishnah notes that. We'll get back to that very shortly. The Mishnah notes that special set of rules about the earthenware vessel. But then it goes on in the last three words in the Hebrew to rule on the earthenware's method of purification. Ushviratan hi taharatan. Translated here in the English is, and when broken, they become pure. That doesn't sound very different from what was said about vessels made from other things earlier in the Mishnah, but it's semantically, ushviratan hi taharatan actually is quite different from what was said of the other vessels, which was nishberu taharu. What's the difference? So the Tosafist, from the school of Rashi's family and successors, whose name was Shimshon of Sens. He's known in more or less in the yeshiva world as the Rosh Mishans. His commentary on all the Mishnayot of this sixth order of the Mishnah is printed on the page of the Vilna Talmud in the usual place where you would find Tosafot in the Talmud. So Shimshon of Sens makes the difference explicit, and that you have as text number 8 on page 8. When broken, they become pure, which is shviratan hi taharatan. He says, well, this is true of all the other vessels as well, as the Mishnah had stated above. But what's different now is the Mishnah now informs us that in the case of earthenware vessels, being broken is the only means of purification. So, for example, immersion will not be effective. Fire certainly will not, because it'll break the earthenware. Being broken is the only means of purification. Shviratan hi taharatan. Breakage is the only way of purifying it. And just to show that what what it is that undergirds that commentary from this Tosafist, the Tosefta, almost a millennium earlier, had also made that very explicit in the very same way. That's briefly text number 9 from the Tosefta of Kelim. Bava Kama means not what we usually think of as tractate Bava Kama. The Tosefta divides that long tractate of Kelim into 3 sections, and this is the first section of Kelim in chapter 7, and just says straight out and very explicitly, V'ein tohara lichli cheres ela shevirato. There is no purifying process for an earthenware vessel other than breaking it. So where are we? There are 8 similes. 7 of them come from biblical metaphors that are metaphors in the Bible. The 8th, which is actually the first in the list, the headliner, that's the odd man out. It's biblical, but it's not metaphorical. And it comes from a priestly text that gave rise to some pretty arcane rabbinic texts about purity laws that even in their own day were already in disuse. So what's with this broken piece of earthenware that even a few centuries after the Mishnah shows up in this poem? Well, wait. Earthenware. Where have we encountered that before? What do we know about vessels created from the earth? What's the first piece of earthenware ever created? So that's text number 10 from Genesis chapter 2. What we've already seen earlier when we were talking about from dust. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et ha'adam afar min ha'adamah. The Lord God formed the human from the dust of the earth. And God blew into its nostrils the breath of life, and thus the human became a living being. God's breath blows into the dust, the afar of the earth, and now something is created. A vessel is created. Dust, afar, also in our poem. Remember that. Adam yesodo me afar v'sofo le'afar. Humans come from the dust and return to the dust. And now the afar becomes the cheres in the poem, the earthenware. So the poet, in other words, has done a remarkable thing. He has taken something from the Torah that is not a metaphor, in Leviticus chapter 6, talking about an actual earthenware vessel, and the poet has now made it into a metaphor. The actual concrete cheres of Leviticus 6 has been transformed now in the poem into a metaphor for the human being who was the first piece of earthenware the world ever knew. And we know that that piece of earthenware, meaning we, can contract impurity. What is the greatest of the impurities in the biblical and rabbinic schemes? The greatest of the impurities, what's called the avi avot hatumah, the granddaddy of all tumah, of all impurity, is the impurity of death. And death can come to us in different ways. It can come to us the way it comes to us earlier in this poem, in the second section. That is an impersonal decree that is written down on Rosh Hashanah, that some of us will die of earthquakes, some of us will die of wildfires, some of us will die of the floods created by hurricanes, or by cancer, or by virus, Magifa. And death also can come to us, as is alluded in the third part of the poem, which focuses us on teshuvah. Death can come to us as a result of our own bad choices. Sometimes it's a physical death, as from addiction. Sometimes those choices from which we are urged to return give rise to a moral death. I want you to look at text number 11 on page 8. It comes from a work known as Amud Hayemet. These are a collection of the teachings of Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, who was compiled by his grandson. And it's a commentary on another verse in Leviticus. Look what he says here. The reason we're coming back to this airspace issue just to alert you. The reason that an earthenware vessel only contracts and transmits impurity through its airspace and cannot be purified by immersion is because earthenware's substance has no real value, being simply earth. It's a dime a dozen. It's not like a silver bowl. It's not like a beautifully planed and turned wooden vessel. It's simply earth. Its only importance is due to its having an inner space that can receive and hold other things. It's that inner space that's important, not the material out of which it's made. And thus, it cannot be susceptible to impurity through its outer wall, only through its inner space, which is its main identity. And then he adds this kicker at the end. And so it is with human beings who are dust of the earth. They have significance only if there's substance within. It's our concavity, it's our airspace that makes the otherwise dust of the earth that will return to the dust, that makes it important and makes it significant. So that's what the Mishnah in this understanding is talking about. It's true of real earthenware, that airspace, just as true of the human being, of which the real earthenware is the metaphor. The only substance is in that hollow space into which God's breath had blown. The only substance is that space in which a divine breath created an invisible, ethereal image of God in our inner recesses. So this now is as far as anything, if you've kind of followed the poet here and done this kind of detective work as to where he got this, this is as far as anything could be from a declaration of human helplessness before forces beyond our control. Yes, it is true that we are all too easily impacted by forces beyond our control that wound us. It is all too true that that there are winds that we don't control that pass over us and within us as well. Just as Unetaneh Tokef had cataloged for us in the second section of the poem, just as Martha learned when she got her diagnosis, and just as the members of Beit HaShita had learned when they saw that pathos-ridden procession of 11 caskets coming back into the kibbutz. It's equally true that our vulnerability extends to all sorts of impurities that we could control, values that distort us and that drive out values that sustain us, addictions to the impermanent things of this world, neglect of our souls and of our sacred relationships. The random, uncontrollable assaults on our fragile being cause our hearts to break. You read that with Martha. And in doing so, they threaten to break as well our belief in the meaningfulness of life. Just as our hearts have the capacity to break when we're forced to acknowledge the existential errors that we have chosen, that we inevitably will make in our lives. But here's the thing, and here's the message. The reason that this odd priestly law had to be mined and had to be made into metaphor and put at the head of the list, this is the reason for that. That when our hearts in fact break within us, the earthenware that we are paradoxically becomes pure again. Shviratan hi taharatan. That breakage is the key and the path to a renewed purity. And if we're able to call on the faith to refuse, not refuse, but refuse those broken pieces, as the Mishnah in Kelim advises us to do, and refuse them into renewed, worthy vessels, if we can call on the faith to do that, they have a future. and so do we. It may be futile to try to control or even to resist the withering of all physical freshness with time's passing, or to try to resist the evaporation of the cloud's water with the shining of the sun, or the passing of the shadow with the sun setting. But it is never futile to attend to the renewal and purification of the shards of our earthen lives. That's what the poem had told us God wants of us. Im yashuv miyad tekablo, ad yom moto techakelo. That's what the poem said? Lo yachpotz b'mot hamet. God is not interested in our final death. In text number 12, which I'm just going to leave for you to read at your leisure, from a book some of you may know, it's a wonderful book of just an endless array of beautiful nuggets that are 2-3 pages long at the most, from the physician Rachel Naomi Remen. It's called My Grandfather's Blessings. You'll see a story here about a woman who, through no things beyond her control, it's like that second section of Unetaneh Tokef, who shall live, who shall die. In her cases, who will have a stroke, who will be disabled in various ways by that stroke, was sure that she was a broken person and could not reveal her true self to anyone. And she only reached redemption when she was able to pick up those pieces and put them back together. If you read that in the context of what we have gone through together here, you will see a really beautiful story that illustrates what we've looked at. But I do strongly suspect that in placing the image of the broken earthenware at the head of the list, I do very much suspect that the author of our poem also had at least 2 other passages in mind. One, a biblical passage, and the other, a rabbinic passage that draws on the biblical passage. And that's what I want you to see in our last 2 texts, both of which are on page 10, text number 13 and 14. So 13 is from Psalm 51, a penitential psalm. It actually has a superscription that says, that puts it in the setting of David feeling remorse after sinning with Bathsheba. And it has this line in verse 19, Zivchei Elohim ruach nishbara. True sacrifice to God is translated here a contrite spirit, but really is a broken spirit, nishbara. And now lev nishbar, lo tivzeh. You will not despise a contrite and, again, contrite, really broken, nishbar. That's cheres hanishbar. A broken and crushed heart. You will not despise a broken and crushed heart. God is looking for the broken heart. So that's Psalm 51. And now a beautiful midrash that appears in the 5th century compilation of homilies, of midrashim, that is known as the Psikta de Rav Kahana. And this is in the section that was prescribed for preaching, reading on Shabbat Shuvah. So let's take a look at this. It's our last text on page 10. Rabbi Abba Bar Yudan said, that which was deemed unfit in the case of animals was declared fit in the case of human beings. Big difference. Regarding animals in the book of Leviticus, the Torah declared that imperfections, blindness, injury, skin cysts, whatever they are, render the animal unacceptable. Even a broken leg, shever regel, is going to make the animal unfit. However, in the case of humans, imperfection can make one acceptable. And the proof text is exactly what we just saw from Psalm 51. God, you will not despise a broken and crushed heart. God's looking for that imperfection, that brokenness in human beings. And then comes the really beautiful end to this midrash. Amar Rabbi Alexandri. Rabbi Alexandri said, Hahedyot, just a regular old person, regular Joe. Im mishtameshu bichli shavur, if a person must make use of a broken tool, it's a cause for humiliation. You want the best craftsman's tools from Sears, made of this forged metal. You don't want to use something, broken and rickety. You're embarrassed to be using that. But it's different in the case of the Blessed Holy One. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Eino Ken. That's not how God works. Kol shimusho kelim shvurim. All of God's work is done with broken vessels. Or as we might say, God's very best work is done with broken tools. I would like to think that Martha may have come to understand that the recommendation in this poem for teshuvah was not so much an accusation that she quite naturally took to be there on its surface. I understand that. I'd like to think that she may have come to understand that it was an allusion to, not that she knew the Mishnah and Kelim, but that she could intuit what the Mishnah and Kelim said. Remember what it said, Chazar. If you are able to return, go back. It's a word that's used with teshuvah. If you're able to go back and refuse the pieces that were broken by nothing of your fault, that is still a possibility. And indeed, it is made possible by the fact that it is the breath of God, after all, that created the vessel in the first place. And I feel similarly that the people of Beit HaShita, in all of their secularity, were drawn so deeply to this prayer, not only by its music, but by the power it somehow wielded to point them towards the refusing of their shattered lives into renewed principle and commitment and mission as secular Zionists. Maybe that also explains the affinity of the poet for Isaiah, because Isaiah is a book that early on speaks warnings about judgment and destruction, but in its latter chapters, what we in our wisdom call Deutero-Isaiah, which, by the way, you saw is copiously quoted in this final part of the poem. That latter part of Isaiah now speaks of a refusing of a national life and a regeneration of what was thought to be lost for all time. So one last thing. You will remember that Yair Rosenblum's rendition stopped at Kachalom Yauf, the dream that vanishes. It did not include the last line, V'atahu melech el chai v'kayam. You are the eternally living sovereign, which, by the way, is another obvious allusion to the phrase in Isaiah, Udvar Eloheinu yakum leolam. The word of our God endures forever. Well, it's understandable why it was left off in a secular kibbutz, and it no doubt would not have landed very well there. But with what we now know, that line is in fact the essential thing that makes this truly into a siluk, properly introducing the uplifting Kedusha. And in order to make that point, I'm going to offer one final point of contrast. Some of you may remember this. In Peter Schaeffer's play, Amadeus, Antonio Salieri comes to think of Mozart as God's magic flute, that God created to be the channel for the divine music that God loves. And Salieri, driven mad by his rivalry with him, slowly drove him to illness and to death in the play. It's not about the historical Salieri. Let's not besmirch his reputation. But when he was finally gone from Salieri's life in the play, here's what he said. I'm quoting from the play now. What did I feel, says Salieri. Relief, of course, I confess it. And pity, too, for the man I helped to destroy. I felt the pity God can never feel. I weakened God's flute to thinness. God blew as he must without cease. The flute split in the mouth of his insatiable need, his capital H. Salieri is depicted here as imagining a narcissistic God uncaring of humanity's frailty, a God whose breath will destroy some beyond repair. But what we have instead in this remarkable poem is an affirmation of the power of the human spirit to renew itself. It's a statement of faith in an eternal God whose breath into the dust doesn't split us into oblivion as Schaeffer's Salieri imagined, but instead it gives us the capacity and the power of renewal that we never need lose as long as we live. That message, I think, is rightly placed liturgically precisely before we say, Kadosh, 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 holy, 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 the very moment that we prepare to reaffirm the sanctity of the God who first blew the breath of human life into what were just clods of ordinary earth, and in the process made us who we are. So that concludes what I have to say and teach about this piyut. I think we have about 11 minutes or so. I see there are like 29 things in the chat. I don't know how many of them are comments or questions, but I think Jen has been monitoring it. And let's see if we can address at least a couple of them. Jen?
Thank you so much, Rabbi Tucker. I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I want to thank you for taking so many pieces of Torah and breathing so much life and beauty into them for us just now. We have a bunch of questions about the breaking, a bunch of really beautiful metaphors that people were working with. One is from Ellen Blaylock, who asked if we could extend the impurity from earthenware that can be removed from brokenness to human recovery from challenge. We created from earth can't really regain purity till we have hit rock bottom and come apart from our challenge.
Yeah, so I think you're just following on, you know, what this distant poet from long ago was trying to at least you know, give us a big wink at, but doing it with the kind of artistry that, you know, that poets love. You know, it's the nature of poetry that one doesn't come and say it explicitly. It requires us to delve into it, and I think what you have just said so beautifully is really you know, part of the essential message that we're expected to get here. And notice how different it is from what could have been taken as the cynical nihilism from in earlier parts of the poem, and that was what I thought was the interesting contrast. That you know, for the believer, you know, we have this thing, you know, the thing about the proverbial red cow. The big paradox is that it makes the pure impure and it makes the impure pure. And something like that happened with Martha, who was the observant Jew, the shul-going Jew, got turned aside by this prayer, and the secular kibbutznik somehow got drawn into it. There is something about the ability to see beyond the surface and beyond the pshat into the poet's mind that can give it that redemptive quality.
Great. And then we had two questions that reflect on burying and burial rituals. The first was, is burying considered an equivalent to breaking? And the second, is that why we put shards on the mate, on the person who has died during the purification process, to signify that the one that died can no longer rebuild the pot that has shattered, repair the broken heart? Oh,
so let me take that second one first. I think the practice in the Chevra Kadisha of putting those that broken pottery on the eyes, which is, you know, the window to the soul, so to speak, I think is meant to almost enact that you know, from you came from dust and you will return to dust. You are earthenware. I I don't know that that the practice arose from the kind of an analysis that I tried to take you on here of, as to how this relates to those seemingly arcane purity laws, so that you could talk about the shattered things can't be put back together again. But it certainly is, you're certainly free to interpret it that way, that there is something about these shattered pieces that either talks about the fact that we can put shattered pieces back together as long as we're living, but we can't anymore after death, or looking towards perhaps a resurrection, that these shattered pieces will in fact come back together. So there's a lot of open gateways, the gates of interpretation never being closed. As for the first part, is burial a kind of brokenness? I wouldn't see it that way. I think the brokenness we're talking about here is that which life does. And it may be the vicissitudes of life that we don't control, or it may be our yetzer, our constitution, that creates a moral brokenness, sometimes even physical brokenness. It's what life does to us. I think the point of burial is a point where all that brokenness is now behind us. And there is a kind of, in a way, a wholeness that comes with burial, precisely because of being returned to the bosom of the earth. That would be my reflection on it.
Great, and I see many questions are coming in. I'm going to do my best to try to collect as many as possible. There was a question about, is there a connection with what you were teaching to the tochel kevoro? Is that what is our inner being counts, because what counts is what we do, and what our yetzer is? Yeah, so tochel kevoro, that this is one of the signals for this in the Torah is that the ark had was outside and inside, covered and overlaid outside and inside with gold. Why does it need to be covered inside? Because no one's looking at that. But it's supposed to be a signal that it's about hypocrisy, that we echad b'peh ve'echad b'lev, that you can't be saying one thing with your mouth and thinking another thing in your heart. So that the outside and the inside have to match. It was also Rabban Gamliel, didn't want any people who were hypocrites coming into his Beit Midrash. But there's an obvious affinity here, and what the Kutzker taught was, how important that inner part is. But in a way, it's not so much toho kevoro, it's that toho is the only thing that matters, right? That is, the outside is as we know, fragile, impermanent. That's who we are as physical beings. That's what we share with everything that lives. We're made of the same language. We know that now. There's only one language that the same language that creates the coronavirus creates us. That's the language of life. It's, the DNA of life. But what's different is what is inside. So it is important for people not to be hypocritical. But I think the deeper lesson here is that it's the turning inward that's the only real truth. And those are things that when there's brokenness in there, that kli cheres that can get that tumah, that impurity, that very brokenness allows it to become to remove the impurity and become renewed and useful vessels once again. Great. Rabbi Paul Winnig was asking about two different juxtapositions. The first is if you can talk about why this is juxtaposed near Kedusha, which I know you spoke about, but as opposed to maybe Shema. And the second is your own juxtaposition. Did your reading of this text change after 9/11? Yeah, so again, let me take the second first, which Pirkei Avot tells you never to do, but that's okay. I'll take the second first. As I indicated, yes, it definitely has changed the way I view it, because I recognize that in the same way that these are metaphors for something else, they actually also have a concretization in the world. And it's something that we New Yorkers, I speak for myself and my neighbors,
where I live, the region in which I live, we saw these concrete things. We saw the passing shadow. We saw the dust being turned up, and we saw the dreams being shattered. So it's a way of I think it is sometimes important to recognize that metaphorizing things is really important and powerful, but sometimes in mikra yotzei midei pshuto, that you have to retain the pshat as well. That there was I don't remember who wrote it, but there's a well-known poem that appears in the many machzorim that takes that second part of the Unetaneh Tokef, who shall live and who shall die, and it all becomes metaphorized, and it's very powerful. It's like the thirst of desire and the fire of of lust, and all of these things, and all of that's fine. But as long as it doesn't help make us forget that there actually are wildfires that may or may not be a result of climate change that we're contributing to, and that and there is drownings by hurricanes, and there are diseases like we're going through right now, really concrete. So I think the 9/11 did bring that home for me, and it remains with me all these almost 20 years later. The idea of why the Kedusha, and why, I don't know, I can't really speak to why not the Shema. It's not as dramatic a point in the service. I mean, there were piyutim written for the Shacharit, the Yotzrot, but this thing at high noon, so to speak, on the day, in the broad daylight of Yom Hadin, which is when the Musaf Kedusha happens. There's something very powerful about that, and I think that's and the poem, I think, does structure itself to enable us to go into it with a sense of the holiness that is within us, that gives us that self-repairing possibility and potential.